Welcome to week 18 of our GCSE revision. We're going to keep going with Nazi Germany. So again, I'm just going to focus on the knowledge here because obviously, as I said before, a lot of the questions are source-based, but obviously I'll just be covering the knowledge here for the knowledge questions. So we're going to focus on Nazi control and dictatorship. So basically, how was Hitler able to kind of control Germans? So the first one is about the Enabling Act. And a little reminder, what that was all about was it kind of started with the infamous burning down of the Reichstag. So you can see in that photo there. So you can imagine if the British Parliament or the British Parliament got burnt down, the impact that would have. So the Nazis blamed it on the communists, and what happened was in order to get their own back on the communists, they passed a law which imprisoned their opponents and they banned any opposition newspapers. They persuaded Hindenburg to call a new election, purely for the purpose of getting more Nazi members into the Reichstag. And just going back all the way back to the beginning, in order to change the constitution in Germany, you need a 2/3 majority. So what they did on the vote before they passed the Enabling Act is lots of members of the SS and the SA were outside the Reichstag building, stopping communists taking up their seats. So the Nazis were able to change the constitution by preventing communists taking their seats. So they passed the infamous Enabling Act of 1933, which pretty much enabled Hitler to do what he wanted it, and it destroyed the power of the Reichstag. So basically the Reich cabinet, which is basically Hitler's henchmen, could pass new laws. These laws could overrule the constitution, and Hitler himself could propose any law. So effectively, from this point, democracy, as we would know it in Germany, ceased. So the impact of this afterwards was the Nazis immediately abolished local government, because again, that was a symbol of democracy, and replaced it with its own Nazi version of Gaultier's. They also got rid of trade unions, because again, they were a threat to the Nazi control, and they replaced this with the German Labour Front, which we'll look at later on. And they also closed down political party offices, took away their money, and basically by July 1933, all political parties, apart from the Nazi Party, had been banned. So this is a real watershed moment where from this point onwards, the Nazis pretty much could do what they wanted. Whether the communists started that fire is by the by. So how did Hitler become Führer? So one of the key things that's important to understand about this was the kind of internal divisions amongst the Nazis. So the SA had obviously helped Hitler to get into power, but Hitler was becoming increasingly concerned about the power of the SA, particularly the actions of Röhm, who was the leader. He was getting increasingly unhappy with Hitler, and they were arguing quite a lot. The army wasn't happy with the SA because it was actually bigger in number than them, and the SS also wanted to reduce their power. So on the 30th of June 1934, something known as the Night of the Long Knives, Röhm and the other leaders were arrested and killed, and they also on the same night arrested the Vice-Chancellor von Papen, who was obviously there to control Hitler. Also, just by pure chance and circumstance, I don't think there was any suspicion here, in August 1934, Hindenburg died. Obviously, Hitler was like, yippee, absolutely fantastic. And he merged the office of President and Chancellor and called it the Führer, which we would know as in English as Supreme Leader. So why was this good for him? Well, basically, it solidified the support of the SS, who obviously were incredibly loyal to him. It was really popular in Germany. This is quite hard for us to understand. But basically, the SS had obviously spent the previous 10 years kind of intimidating people, bullying people, and he was seen to be dealing with the bully. It also enabled, the propaganda machine to kind of build this cult around Hitler. And also, infamously, he forced the army to swear an oath of allegiance to himself as Führer. So if the generals going forward in the war did not obey his commands, they were being treacherous and could be charged with treason. So that's quite important for Hitler and his power base. Okay, the next question is, how was he be able to control people? So there's a number of ways he did this. First of all was using the policing system. So the SS, led by Heinrich Himmler, basically they just did whatever they wanted. They're totally outside of the law, knock on your door in the middle of the night, take you away. People were generally terrified of the SS. They were running the concentration camps, and whispers and rumours of these were kind of running right around Germany. The other group was the SD, the security service, a bit like MI5. This was led by a guy called Heinrich, and effectively they were running spies abroad and in Germany. And last but not least was the infamous Gestapo, also led by Heinrich, and the plainclothes police, whose job was to spy on people. And the power of the Gestapo was really, nobody knew who was Gestapo and who wasn't Gestapo. So anybody could be Gestapo. So that was incredibly effective in kind of limiting the criticism of the German government. The second thing they did was obviously control the courts. So they've got a load of judges there swearing their allegiance to Hitler. And, in order to become a judge in Nazi Germany, you had to favour the Nazi party. So, surprise, surprise, if you went to court and you had said things against the Nazi party, guilty or not guilty? Let me guess. They also abolished juries, so basically, it was just the rule of the judge, who obviously were going to rule on the side of the Nazi party, and often they'd run secret courts where they, wouldn't even bother with evidence, and they just rule guilty straight away. Also, the third thing would be concentration camps. So, concentration camps were actually built in quite isolated places, and lots of Germans said after the war they weren't actually aware of concentration camps. But, people were afraid of them, whispers and rumours. First one was built at Dachau. The majority of the prisoners were obviously Germans, political prisoners, communists, trade union members, and they were forced to do hard labour, and often were worked to death quite brutally. But that's more about a fear factor. Okay, a biggie here is about how he controlled people was through propaganda. So the chief propaganda person was a guy called Joseph Goebbels. He was an absolute expert. These days he would be heading up an advertising agency and working for McDonald's or whatever, trying to sell their products. So I'm just drinking a bit of that. And obviously the idea was to spread, Nazi ideas. He also established something called the Reich Chamber of Culture. And really what that was about was basically to centralise everything. So architecture, artists, making sure people were listening to music like Beethoven and Bach. Another important aspect of this was censorship. So infamously in 1933 they burnt a lot of books by Jewish authors. Radio newspapers were literally told what to say or write, so there's no independent journalism. Any opposition newspapers were closed down, and radios that were built could not receive, the BBC or any foreign radio station. So that's part of that. Lastly was how did they do it? Well, huge posters everywhere, colour, massive rallies like the famous Nuremberg rally. People want to be part of a winning team. That's just human nature. Why are you not at the rally today, son? The cinema, all the movies were Nazi movies, radio. Artists were encouraged to paint, flattering pictures of the Nazi party. American black jazz music was banned. And believe it or not, just by pure chance, the Olympic Games were held in Nazi Germany in 1936. And this presented the perfect opportunity for the Nazis. So they built fantastic stadium, the Aryan superior athletes and all this kind of stuff. So, the Nazis, generally, people around the world were like, wow, these people are amazing. So, even people in Britain were impressed by things that were going on in Nazi Germany, all propaganda. Okay, how did he deal with the church? Now, obviously the church was a big threat because, people would go to church every Sunday, they'd be listening to the sermon, etc. So Hitler and the Nazis understood the power of the church and they dealt with it accordingly. So first of all, infamously, they went to Rome and there's the Pope there signing an agreement, a concordant with the Nazis, that if the Nazis allowed Catholics to worship freely, that the church would stay out of politics. Now, Hitler didn't keep his word about this. Priests were harassed, Catholic schools and youth organisations were closed, but really, that was an infamous agreement. I mean, the Pope did later on criticise the Nazi party, but by that point the damage was done. The Protestant faith was obviously the biggest faith in Germany. Martin Luther going all the way back established the Protestant church. So what the Nazis did here, which I think was, pretty amazing, they set up their new church and they called it the Reich Church. And about 2,000 priests and churches were set up, and they supported the Nazis, and they had like swastikas over the altar and all this kind of stuff. In opposition to this, there was another church called the Confessional Church, which is the majority of churches, about 6,000. They generally opposed the Nazis. The main opposition leader is a guy called Martin Niemöller, and about 6,000 priests opposed the Nazis, and about 800 were sent to concentration camps. So all in all, the Nazis understood the threat the church posed, and they dealt with it, picked them off one by one. But even so, the church was still quite a powerful critical voice of the Nazis.